This morning, we're going to be continuing our series in Galatians. So if you'd like to turn to Galatians chapter 3, it's where we're going to be based today, page 1155. With those of you with a Bible on a seat near you, please do have those open. It's really helpful, actually, to have the Bible open as we go through this, because we're going to work through these 9 verses at the start of chapter 3, but also let's remember that this is written as a letter to the churches in Galatia. It's a letter in its entirety. Yes, we're going to look at one little bit, but also as we're going through, do please be looking back at the verses beforehand, the 2 chapters we've looked at already. Because what we'll find, particularly today, is that Paul works through his argument throughout the letter. Myself and Simon on Friday, as we were praying together, we had the joy actually of just reading through the letter together in its entirety. And it's wonderful to hear how Paul does lay down the foundations for his arguments and then gives more examples later on. So let's not forget that as we come to this part of Scripture. It was a letter that was written. I also want to remind us what we've been hearing over the last couple of weeks in those first 2 chapters about the gospel. Now, those of you that had the privilege of being here last Sunday and hearing Simon speak on those last few verses of chapter 2, outlining to us what the gospel is and how we keep hold of it, let's remember back to that now. Remember Christ portrayed as crucified before us, as we're going to see. The wonderful truth of the gospel that faith in Jesus and all that he has done is enough for our salvation, enough for us to be justified, made right before God. Let's keep hold of that as we come to these verses. His life, his death, and his resurrection. When I'm preparing these preachers, I love looking and seeing where each of these verses fit in with the bigger story of the Bible. And we get that in the letter to the Galatians. When I preached a couple of weeks ago, we looked back into Acts, didn't we? We looked to see what was happening in the churches. But also, let's see this in the context then of what Paul continued to write to the churches. We have a number of other letters that he wrote to the church in Rome. He wrote to the church in Philippi and other ones as well. He continued to say the same thing to them. And Romans particularly is such a wonderful, wonderful book. And this thing of what Simon was preaching about last week of being justified through faith in Jesus Christ, Paul also reaffirms in Romans chapter 8. He said, "For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. And those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified." So you can see then how Paul has, in the letter to Galatians, spoken about what it is to be justified by faith. And that fits in to what he was then saying to the church in Rome, this wider thing of God's calling on us. And actually, it's all God's work. Therefore, as we place our hope firmly in the gospel, we also then know those he justified, he also glorified. We can live with joy and with hope because of what God says and what he is going to do. So as we come into chapter 3, what this essentially is doing is laying out now the arguments that Paul is going to make over the coming chapters. So as much as we're going to look at these 9 verses, this sets us up for what's to come now in the next few weeks. So I hope you stay around and you can hear some of that in a little bit more detail. Also, some of the arguments that he makes, Paul does then give us further examples in chapter 5 and chapter 6 that we won't necessarily look at today because we'll save those for a couple of weeks' time. But we get Paul now addressing the Christians in these churches in Galatia at the time, and he confronts them with questions. A technique that he uses to get them thinking about their own salvation, the gospel that they've heard, what they've also read in these first 2, it wouldn't have been chapters, it would have just been the first bit of the letter that he had written to them. He now confronts them with questions. I wonder if you've ever kind of been confronted with questions. I'm pretty sure you have, particularly when you were younger. Have you ever had that question? What were you thinking? What did you think that was going to end well? Do you really think that was going to work? People could have said the same thing about what we just did here, getting everyone up to say the video, but I think that worked. I think we just about got away with it. But when you're younger, there are things that you do that your parents or someone else may come and say, what were you thinking? And the purpose of being confronted with questions is to get us to do exactly that, to think it through. And that's what Paul does to the Christians in Galatia. He asks them questions, and actually it's a way that we too can now respond to this passage in Scripture. So what I'm doing today, I want to lay before us these 5 questions that Paul gives to them in order to provoke us to think about it, think it through, think through the implication and the application of the gospel that we've just heard about. Hopefully you don't have to hear that phrase too often, what were you thinking, anymore. I think something that comes with wisdom and maturity is learning when not to try. Do you think so? You realize, actually, I'm not capable of doing that anymore. You know, that fence that I could jump over, no, it's just it's not even worth trying anymore. And as you get older, as you get wiser, you realize there are certain things you shouldn't even attempt to do. But as we come now to the gospel, Paul is addressing those who have already placed their faith in Jesus. So that's how we need to read these questions that we are coming to here. Now, as I've said, the gospel is open to all. The gospel is the good news about Jesus Christ. And if you this morning here have not yet put your faith in Jesus, there is a wonderful opportunity for you to hear the gospel that we're going to read here and believe. Believe that Jesus is enough. Believe that Jesus is the best. And there we are. We can start upon what we're about to read here, this journey that we then go through. But also for those of you that have placed your faith in Jesus, we need to listen to these questions that Paul then places to those who were in Galatia. So let's read through Galatians chapter 3 and verse 1 to 9. Be careful of the language at the start here. O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? It was before your eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified. Let me ask you only this. Here are the questions that he places before them. Did you receive the Spirit by works of the law or by hearing with faith? Are you so foolish? Having begun by the Spirit, are you now being perfected by the flesh? Did you suffer so many things in vain, if indeed it was in vain? Does he who supplies the Spirit to you and works miracles among you do so by works of the law or by hearing with faith? Just as Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness. Know then that it is those of faith who are sons of Abraham. And the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, in you shall all nations be blessed. So then, those who are of faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. Let me just pray for us. Father, we thank you for your word. We ask now that those words that we've just read, by your Spirit, would rest deeply in us. We give ourselves, we submit ourselves to what we have just read and ask for you to speak to us. We thank you for the truth of the gospel. We thank you for the grace in which we now live. And also we thank you for the Spirit that has been given for us in order for us to be able to take hold of what you say and put it into action. Amen. So you may think that chapter 3 starts a little bit harshly. You know, we've had Paul having 2 chapters of explaining to them the gospel, has put before them, this is the issue that you've got, is that I've told you the gospel and some other people have followed in behind me and now telling you that you need to do extra things in order to receive salvation. In order to be made right before God, you need to do these extra things. So Paul has told them, this is your problem. He doesn't then hold back, does he, at the start of chapter 3? Oh, foolish Galatians. They've acted like fools. He's saying that you have lost your minds. Now, we spent a few months in the book of Proverbs, and hopefully through that we understand and we remember a little bit about what it was to be a fool. We had the pictures of two people, didn't we, in Proverbs, the wise man and the foolish man. What Paul here is saying is they are foolish people. In chapter 18 of Proverbs, remember, a foolish person does not delight in understanding. In chapter 28 of Proverbs, a foolish man trusts in his own heart. So Paul is then applying that and saying, what you are doing here, you've lost the understanding that I gave you. You are trusting in something of your own hearts. Romans 1, Paul speaking to the church there, says this, claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Paul is pretty consistent in what he calls out as foolishness. Idolatry, placing things before God, worshipping things that are not him, things that resemble mortal man, our own thinking, our own understanding. So the question initially for us, we hear this phrase, oh, foolish Galatians. Well, do we just apply it to them and look down upon them and say, oh, yeah, they were pretty foolish. I wouldn't have fallen for that. Or actually, is there something that we can now learn from these coming verses and these coming questions that brings us back to what the gospel truly is and how we then live it out? And it's important that we do take that on. As I said, this isn't the only time that Paul talks about this. He didn't put this letter to the churches in Galatia and say, right, that's it. Everyone now is going to understand it. No, he has to go to the other churches as well. Say it to them. This is a thing that seems to happen throughout history, and we can see it throughout the history of the church. We need to keep reminding ourselves, coming back to the gospel, making sure we are not foolish and being those who delight in our own understanding or trust in our own hearts. But also know this. Paul has said, oh, foolish Galatians. It could have just ended there. He could have just dismissed them. You're foolish. I give up on you. What he then does over these coming 4 chapters that we're going to go through over the next couple of weeks, he reasons with them. He gives them reasons why they should place their hope in this. So even in calling them foolish people, what have you've lost an understanding of it. He then does reason with them. So placing the gospel before people, placing the gospel for people of God, I trust can bring us into alignment with that. And that's what we're going to do over these coming weeks. So the first question he then brings to them, who has bewitched you? Again, this is a very harsh start of this chapter. Oh, foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Using a phrase that we don't see often in the scriptures. In fact, this is the only time that we see it in the New Testament. Who has bewitched you? Using a phrase that they would have known about, looking at pagan gods, pagan magic. Who has gained control of your mind? It's as though you've lost sense of it. Someone has brainwashed you. People have come in and bringing something which is not of God. When he's saying, who has bewitched you? Yes, he could be saying, well, look to those who have actually come in and said these things to you, but also recognize the spiritual reality of what has happened here. Who has bewitched you? This is something not of God. Therefore, when it's something not of God, it's going to be of Satan, the enemy of God, who's trying to bring in and take them away from the freedom that they have in the gospel. When Paul was writing to the church in Ephesus, he said, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. That passage from Ephesians there, looking at what we're fighting against, is in the context of Paul talking about the armor of God. And what protects our head and our minds? The helmet of salvation. He lays it to that church there. He builds upon it a few years later as he writes to the church in Ephesus. This thing, placing upon our heads the helmet of salvation, which is the gospel, which is saying my salvation is won not through what I have done, not through what I have earned, but through what Jesus has done for me, the sufficiency of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. And that's why when we see here in verse 1, Paul then says it was before your eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified. As soon as he raises the issue of them losing sense of their minds and being bewitched, having some falsehood put into their minds, the first thing he brings them back to is the crucified Christ, reminding them of what they saw themselves. Clearly, Paul spoke to them about the crucifixion. Actually, we can read it in Acts chapter 13. We have the account of what he said to the church in Antioch, which was in Galatia. He said this to them: brothers, sons of the family of Abraham, and those among you who fear Jesus, to us has been sent the message of this salvation. For those who live in Jerusalem and their rulers, because they did not recognize him, Jesus, nor understand the utterance of the prophets, which we read every Sabbath, he fulfilled them by condemning them. And though they found him no guilt worthy of death, they asked Pilate to have him executed. And when they carried out all that was written of him, they took him down from the tree and laid him in the tomb. But God raised him from the dead. And for many days he appeared to those who had come up with him from Galilee to Jerusalem. Paul clearly portrayed Christ crucified. He told them what had happened. They weren't able to watch the news to get the update on this. They weren't able to watch a YouTube shorts about this, of the crucifixion summarized for them in 3 minutes. No, he came and told them from the eyewitness accounts that had been written down about the crucifixion what it was. He spoke to them about the trial of Jesus. He spoke to them about the crucifixion. He spoke to them about the resurrection. He spoke to them about those who can testify to have seen the risen Lord Jesus. That's what he means when he said he spoke about that Christ was publicly betrayed before you. Another way you could say it is he evidently set forth before them. And the challenge for us, do we come back to the cross often enough? It's one reason why we want to break bread together every week, is so that we, at least every Sunday, are coming to that to remind ourselves, and I'll speak about that a bit more at the end. But when we're speaking about the gospel of Jesus, and this is a challenge to myself as well when I'm speaking with others, do I evidently set forth the crucified Jesus? Because that's what Paul is saying to them we should be doing, and that's what he calls them back to, for them to understand what it is to be saved. So that's this first question that we've looked at. And then Paul puts forward these 4 questions to them, confronting them and reminding them, getting them to think about their own salvation stories, what has happened for the churches where they were, and then getting them to think it through. So we're just going to look through those one at a time very briefly. And then we're going to have some time at the end to pray together. We have time to break bread together, receive the Spirit as we're going to read about here. So I want to give plenty of time for us to do that. So the first question that he asked them in verse 2, let me ask you only this. And in only this, he means 4 questions, don't worry. Let me ask you only this. Did you receive the Spirit by works of the law or by hearing with faith? He brings them back to that moment when they put their faith, they believed in what Paul had told them about the crucified Jesus, about his death, his resurrection, and his appearances. Did you receive the Spirit by works of the law? Did you work for it? When I portrayed it to you, Paul is saying, when the gospel is presented, did you earn it? Is it because you had followed all these instructions? Is it because you had looked back and made sure you had followed this all your life? Or was it by hearing with faith? Because Jesus has already told us about what it is to be saved, what happens at spiritual birth. He says, truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. That which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. That was Jesus speaking to Nicodemus in John chapter 3. Jesus already explained to them what happens. Therefore, in believing in Jesus, we are born of the Spirit. Maybe look back on your own conversion. Look back on what happened when you were born again. That's what Paul is asking them to do. Look back. What happened then? For me, I can look back at a young boy who put his faith in Jesus and actually was filled with such joy that he was bouncing up and down on his bed. That's what I want to look back to. That's what I want to see as someone who has received it, not because I was young, I hadn't done anything particularly to deserve it, but I'd had the gospel explained to me wonderfully by my parents. And then said, yes, I'm going to believe this. And I want to remember that personal joy. When he's saying to the churches in Galatia, he's asking them to look back. We know what happened to them. In Acts chapter 13, in Antioch, in one of these churches, it says the disciples were filled with joy and with the Spirit. That is what Luke wrote down in the Acts account. What happened in that area? A church was then formed from that. They were filled with joy and with the Holy Spirit. Paul's saying, look back to that. Did you receive the Spirit at that point because you had followed the law or because you believed? They would have known they hadn't followed the law, particularly those who were of the Jewish background. They would have known the failures that they had done, how they had missed everything that had been written in the law. And then when he's putting that towards the Gentile believers as well, or Gentile sinners as he refers to in chapter 2, they haven't followed the law, and yet they received the Holy Spirit. They were filled with joy and with the Spirit. He's saying, look back on that. Was that something that happened to you, or did you have to work for it? Assurance can be found in the Spirit when we look back to what he has done for us. Think it through. What happened to you? In Romans 8, he says this to the church there, for you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you received the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirits that we are children of God. Think back to that moment when all you did is you cried, Abba, Father. When you look back to your Heavenly Father and said, I love you. I'm placing my hope firmly in you. Think back to that. The second question he puts before them, having begun by the Spirit, this is verse 3, having begun by the Spirit, are you now being perfected by the flesh? Having begun by the Spirit, he's reminded them, this is how it started. You were born of the Spirit when you believed in Jesus, you received the Spirit, you were filled with joy. Having begun by the Spirit, are you now being perfected by the flesh? And that's definitely a question to think through, isn't it? If we can remember our spiritual life beginning with a work of the Spirit, why would we now go into a position of thinking that we can be perfected, the ongoing working out of our salvation, by anything other than the Spirit? Paul is pointing out and highlighting their inconsistencies in their behavior. That's what he's doing. He's pointing it out to them. This doesn't match up. If you started like this, why would you want to continue in your own strength? If you're traveling a long distance, if you start in a car, you're not going to get halfway and then go, actually, I know what I'm doing now. I can get out and I'll finish this off myself. No, you stay with it. You stay with the thing that started you off there, that's getting you there. Why would you in any way? You think, oh, yes, I know, I've sat in this car long enough now to know how this works. I can do that myself. No. Having begun by the Spirit, you're now being perfected by the flesh. And remember, what we're talking about here with the flesh is to do with that sense of independence, self-assertion, wanting to do it yourself, thinking that you've worked it out, that therefore I now need to work on it in order to earn my salvation. The joy that Paul is saying here is that, yes, we will continue to be perfected, but that is a work of the Spirit. That's not a work of the flesh. That's not something we're going to be able to do just because we try a little bit harder, just because we get a better understanding. No, we apply things, we hear with faith. And what that means is that we apply faith to what we hear. So when we hear the truth of the gospel, when we hear about the simplicity of placing our hope in what Jesus has done, hearing by faith just means we place our faith in that. So how do we do that? How do we continue to live by the Spirit? Well, this is something that gets covered a little bit later on in the book of Galatians. So I don't want to run into those verses too much. But just to say, if we as a church are saying we want to be those known for radical truth and radical love, actually, those are two great things for us to do by the Spirit. We need to be those who are putting our hope in the truth of the gospel, therefore making sure the word of God lives deeply in us. It means we're those that pray together, pray in families, pray with one another, pray by ourselves with our Heavenly Father, that we apply the truth in that way, that we rely upon the Spirit, that we gather together. We had the wonderful 10 things that Simon gave us last week of what it is to put into action the gospel and for it to live in us. Well done for doing one of those things of Sundaying the gospel. You come up, you've turned up on a Sunday, you've done one of the 10 that Simon suggested we did last week. But again, it's not that you then need to get 3 or 4 out of 10 to make it work. Now, these are just good things to do. We're not trying to get to a certain level for it to work out, but they are great things. And also, as we're perfected by the Spirit, this works itself out in love. It works itself out in radical love. Radical love that is selfless, that puts others before ourselves, which does not envy. Again, I'm drifting into some of the verses later on about what love is. I won't go there too much, but that thing of does not envy, particularly to do with this thing of working and feeling as though you need to get to a certain standard. You can look at others and start to envy where they are. But actually, the gospel is worked out, and we are perfected by the Spirit as we love one another. We're selfless, and we do not envy one another. So Paul also then goes on to ask them the question, did you suffer so many things in vain, if it was indeed for vain? So this can be translated as actually they had suffered for the gospel. If they had experienced persecution, maybe they'd been cast out of different things. Actually, he's saying to them, well, did you suffer in vain? Did you put up with all this stuff if you're then going to think that you can do it yourselves? Or actually, it can be so, or did you experience these things in vain? Again, reminding them of all the things that they had seen and done, what God had been doing in them. Either way, it was only in vain if they were relying upon their own strength rather than the things of the Spirit. That's what Paul is asking them to think about. So all the things that you've gone through, maybe things that you've suffered, is that all in vain? Or actually, is there suffering because you've placed your hope in Jesus and therefore he sustains you through that? He puts you in church community and family that helps you in that as we one another together and look to Jesus, as we support each other, fixing our eyes upon him. And finally, Paul says to them, does he who supplies the Spirit to you and works miracles among you do so by works of the law or by hearing with faith? So the things that they had seen, the miracles that they had seen, which again, we can read back into Acts. Acts chapter 14 gives us these things. In Iconium, again, one of the other churches in Galatia, it says that many signs and wonders were performed in front of them. We even get a specific example when Paul went to Lystra, again, another church in the region of Galatia, We have the account in Acts chapter 14, verse 8 through to 10, talking about the healing of a crippled man. They saw this happen before their very eyes. And Paul is saying, does he who supplies the Spirit to you and work these miracles among you do so by works of the law? Again, think it through in your own life. The things that you've seen, those experiences maybe that you have either had yourself of healing or other miracles that can only be explained by the work of God as you've prayed to him and the work of the Spirit. Did those things happen because you worked hard or because of the grace of God? Or by applying by applying faith to the things that you heard? You may have had healing that happened because, well, you looked to Jesus and he said, I can heal you. And you've come to him and said, Jesus, heal me. You know, throughout my life, I've had examples of healings myself, wonderful testimonies of mainly self-inflicted rugby injuries that can be. I even had one where I'd injured my knee one week and had been prayed for and it had been healed. It's great. I went up the next week, but unfortunately my thumb had been injured that following week as I played. So I was giving testimony to the healing of the knee, but also then still had the next injury. So I didn't quite learn with that one. But I can look back at my own healing. I can look back at our youngest daughter, Zoe, who at the age of 2 was in Great Ormond Street with pneumonia. And actually wonderfully seeing her healed then. But even now looking back on it, thinking we've gone through a pandemic where it was a respiratory disease that was quite serious. And we've had no issues or concerns with her. She's had nothing that's come back, even at a young age, having had that serious illness. We can thank God. And was that because I earned it, because I worked hard, or was that because we heard with faith? There are others in the church here, and this is why we want to share stories. We want to share the stories of what God has done with us so that we can look back on that and say, this is what God has done. And therefore, was that because we worked hard? I can assure you there's plenty of things that we get wrong here. There's plenty of things that I get wrong. And it's not because I'm following a list of rules and getting it right all the time. It's because we're hearing with faith. We're reading the truth of the gospel when we read the accounts of Jesus and what he did. And say, I'm going to place my hope firmly in that. And then the last part of our verses here, verses 6 through to 9. We're not going to go into those into too much detail because actually next week, the next part of chapter 3 does go into look at this in a little bit more detail in terms of how it relates to Abraham. But Paul does bring them back to Abraham in the sense of what it is to place your faith in Jesus. Abraham, someone who the Jewish nation would look back to, the father of our nation. Paul takes them right back to that point and says, well, let's go back to the start of where God called Abraham. Was it because he had earned it? The promises that were given to Abraham of the blessing that he would be to the nations way before the law was given. Therefore, Paul is saying to them, well, even looking back at your own history, was it because of the works of the law, or was it by hearing with faith? Just as Abraham believed God, then it was counted to him as righteousness. What a wonderful thing that we can look back even into those early chapters of the Bible. And as it says here, the gospel was preached. See that in verse 8 here. It says, and scripture foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles, so those from outside of the nation that came from Abraham, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, in you shall all nations be blessed. That was a proclamation of the gospel. What a wonderful thing that we can then say to our Jewish brothers and sisters. The gospel has been proclaimed right from the beginning. The gospel has been spoken as it was said to Abraham, in you shall all nations be blessed. That is the gospel because it points us to Jesus. And take this as an encouragement. Verse 9. So then, those who are of faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. If you are of faith, you are someone who very simply has put their faith in the finished work of Jesus on the cross, then you stand alongside Abraham, blessed alongside him, who was the man of faith. What a glorious position that brings us to. And what I want us to do now is to have a bit of time to pray for one another, to respond to this, to break bread together, to bring us back to the centrality of the cross. Bring us back to the finished work of Jesus. Because as Paul said right at the start of this chapter here, it is in the proclaiming and the Christ publicly crucified, portrayed as publicly crucified before you. That is the thing that actually breaks this bewitching spell that can come upon us, that causes us to think that there is some way that we can earn what we've done, or even pay back to God what he has done for us. The way in which that bewitching spell of legalism and needing to work for it is broken is through seeing Christ publicly portrayed as crucified before us. And one of the ways we get to do that is by coming to the table. It's by coming to what Jesus called us to do, to come and take of the bread, which speaks of his body given for us. The sacrifice that was laid down by him being sufficient for us to sustain us, to nourish us, something that we can look to then come and take of and drink of this covenant that Jesus made with his blood. That's why we take the wine and grape juice at the back. It's because we are placing our hope firmly in what Jesus has done, his covenant promise to us. The covenant promise that was said to Abraham, that was spoken to Abraham, through you all nations will be blessed. Jesus then says, this is my covenant to you. This is the one I want you to come back to. We can remember what was said to Abraham, but Jesus is saying, I now take this. I now take this cup that was a symbol that the Jewish nation would use to look back to the Exodus and then coming out of slavery there. Jesus took that and said, this is my blood of a new covenant for you. And we can therefore stand in the truth of that. And that's the joy we get to do. So as we come and take the bread and the wine, I want us to share that together. But also, let's answer some of these questions that Paul has put before us here. Did you receive the Spirit by works of the law or by hearing with faith? Remind yourself, I've placed my faith in what Jesus has done. And also enjoy the Spirit. You have received the Spirit as you have placed your hope in Jesus. Let's enjoy that as we come and pray now together. The Spirit brings joy. There are fruits of the Spirit, as we will see later on in Galatians. There are also gifts of the Spirit that are given to the church to build us up. Let's use some of those. If you here are unwell at the moment, let's pray for you. Graham, how's the finger doing? Are we still? Let's get praying back again for that. Okay, there are things guys that we can come to, place our faith in what Jesus has done. I'm not praying for someone to be healed based on my own works. We're praying for people to be healed based on what Jesus has done and what he says that we can do. So let me pray for us, and then we'll share the bread and wine together. Claire will come back and lead us in a song as we do that. Father, we thank you for all that we're getting to enjoy now. Thanks is all that we can bring to you, because we've got nothing else, because you have done everything for us. And if you have done a work in us by your Spirit in bringing about new life, we thank you that we can have confidence that we will be perfected by the work of the Spirit in us. Therefore, Father, now we ask for, once again, your Spirit to move amongst us. We thank you that we have received the Spirit. The Spirit has also been poured out. And therefore, as we receive that, we can know joy. We can know peace. We can have a hope that goes beyond just what we see in this life around us. And we thank you, Father, that that is open to all. Because Jesus, you died for all. It is enough. Your sacrifice on the cross is enough for all to look to and be saved. Therefore, we respond to that and place our hope in your sacrifice, Jesus. Amen.